Tonight's lecture is over community ecology. James Roger steered his canoe toward a large cypress tree as sunlight trickled through the dizzy pattern of leaves overhead. The tree had several wood stork nests in it, and Rogers and his assistant wanted to get a closer look at all of them. They were in the thick of a dense swamp near the northwestern edge of the Florida Everglades, and it was the height of breeding season for the storks. Eggs had hatched, and nestlings everywhere were crying loudly for food. Rogers was silent. He knew from his experience that too much human disturbance could, quote-unquote, flush the wary adult storks, forcing them to flee in a hurry, which would leave their babies vulnerable to aerial predators such as hawks or crows that would feed on the chicks in the nest. The wood stork is an unassuming sort of bird, more than 3 feet tall, yes, but also covered with a molted black and white coat of feathers, bland compared to some of its tropical neighbors. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission keeps close tabs on the ranks of the wood storks. Here's why. In the late 1970s, the number of nesting pairs in Florida began to plummet, falling from an estimated 10,000 in 1975 to around 2,600 in 1978. By the early 1980s, the bird had earned a spot on the endangered species list, and numbers continued to drop. It was then that Rogers and his colleagues were first tasked with determining which of several factors, reducing nesting habitat, health of females, damaged feeding grounds, was most responsible for the decline of this particular bird. And it was through those research efforts, focused intently on the wood stork, that they found an entire ecosystem on the brink. And this slide shows inlets of Everglades National Park, which contain a unique mix of tropical and temperate plants and animals, including more than 700 plant and 300 bird species. And that brings us to our key concept number 1. Community ecologists study the many populations that live and interact within a given area. Moving on, community ecology is the study of how all the populations in a given ecosystem function, how space is structured, why certain species thrive in certain areas, and how individual species in the same community interact with one another and with their habitat. So each species there occupies a unique niche, that is, its role and set of interactions in the community, how it gets its energy and nutrients, and its preferred habitat. Some species will be niche specialists. They have very specific habitat or resource requirements, and this restricts where they can live. However, specialists often are highly adapted to acquire these resources and outcompete others who might be trying to utilize the same resources. On the other end of the spectrum are niche generalists. These species can use a wide variety of resources. The advantage to this adaptation is flexibility. If one food source dwindles, for example, the generalist can simply switch to another. In the Everglades, the alligator is a generalist with regard to food choices. It will eat just about anything. The wood stork is more of a specialist feeder and prefers fish of a certain size that are found in shallow, murky water. As long as these fish are present, the stork's exceptional fishing skills give it an advantage over other fish predators. But if these fish are few in number, the stork has few other options, turning to the less abundant salamanders and frogs or trying to catch larger or smaller fish. Ecological communities are complex places defined by many interconnected species. The Everglades is made up of a wide variety of ecosystems, marshes, prairies, swamps, and forests, each with an array of species that are adapted to the unique conditions of their habitat and that interact closely with each other. The wood stork is one of many different Everglades wading birds that feast on fish, crustaceans, frogs, and insects. Sawgrass, periphyton, which is a mix of algae and bacteria, and an assortment of small plants and water-tolerant trees, support a wide variety of birds, reptiles, mammals, fish, and countless insects. The alligator serves as an important apex predator. All these populations together make up the communities of the Everglades. Community ecologists investigate how various species contribute to ecosystem services like pollination, water purification, and nutrient cycling. For example, wetlands like the Florida Everglades help capture contaminants and excess nutrients, preventing them from reaching downstream fresh and saltwater ecosystems. The slow-moving water is better able to soak into the ground, which helps refill groundwater supplies, and the wetland provides flood control, vital ecosystem services for the people of South Florida. But human impact has drained much of the wetland and reordered the landscape, and pollution has disrupted nutrient cycles. Actions that are altering the ability of the Everglade communities to continue to provide these services. Before giving way to a hodgepodge of resorts, sugar plantations, and dense urban centers, the region was defined by an uninterrupted web of natural ecosystems collectively known as the Everglades that stretched from Lake Okeechobee to the Florida Bay. It was here that wood storks flourished. In the 1930s, an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 pairs nested throughout the southeastern United States, largely in South Florida, where foraging grounds were ideal. But it was not long after they first discovered the Everglades that American explorers began hatching plans to drain and develop them. Swamps and muddy rivers, choked with grass, were seen as having no inherent value. From the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, the United States went through a period in which wetland removal was not questioned. The Central and Southern U.S. Florida Project, authorized by the U.S. Congress in 1948, set out to systematically drain the Everglades. As the human population swelled in the region, water that once fed the swamps and marshes was drained away or rerouted to the faucets of burgeoning developments. And as water levels changed, becoming deeper in some areas and completely disappearing in others, the total wading bird population plummeted by 90% between the 1930s and the 1990s. As ecologists would soon discover, these changes disrupted the entire ecosystem, from the health of giant wading birds right down to the movement of matter and energy. And that brings us to our infographic number 1 on page 82. An ecological community consists of all the populations of species that live and interact in one area. In the Florida Everglades, different communities can be found in the lagoons, out in the sawgrass marshes, in the cypress swamps, and in many other unique habitats in this large wetland ecosystem. Unique communities that are all interdependent and connected. The species that make up the given community fill specific niches, and each contributes to the overall health of the ecosystem. And that brings us to our key concept number 2. The flow of matter and energy through a community is represented by a food chain that shows who eats whom and always begins with producers. The combination of all the food chains in one area makes up a community's food web. So energy is the foundation of every ecosystem. It is captured by photosynthetic organisms and then passed from organism to organism via the food chain, a simple linear path that shows who eats whom. Any given ecosystem might have dozens of individual food chains. Linked together, they create a food web which shows all of the many connections in the community. Both food chains and food webs help ecologists track energy and matter through a given ecosystem. They can vary greatly in length and complexity between different types of ecosystems, but most share a few common features, and all are made up of the same basic building blocks, namely producers and consumers. So the Florida wood storks sit near the top of the food web that begins with sawgrass, other plants like cypress and mangrove trees and periphyton. These photosynthetic organisms are all known as producers. Producers capture energy directly from the sun and convert it to food or sugar via photosynthesis. They are eaten by a wide range of consumers. That is, organisms that gain energy and nutrients by eating other organisms. Animals, fungi, most bacteria, and protozoa are consumers. So the wood stork is a specialist feeder that hunts almost exclusively in shallow, muddy, plant-filled water that is so cloudy that fish cannot be seen. It walks through the water, snatching up fish it feels with its long bill with a reflex that snaps its bill shut in just 25 milliseconds. That's the fastest reflex known in all vertebrates, and it enables the wood stork to capture prey that no other wading birds can access. But for this to work, the prey must be densely concentrated. Even a small drop in feeding success can impact the ability of these birds to successfully rear their young, a factor that can have serious repercussions for this K-selected species. Storks mature slowly and may not reproduce until they are 4 years old. They lay a single clutch of eggs per year, and it is only in years of abundant food that all the young, perhaps 3 or 4, survive. In lean years, only one chick may survive, or none. So it is this sensitivity that makes the wood stork such a good indicator species for the Everglades. An indicator species is one that's particularly vulnerable to ecosystem perturbations. Because even minor environmental changes can affect them dramatically, they can warn ecologists of a problem before it grows. It is much easier to follow 1 or 2 species than to try and monitor an entire ecosystem. And that brings us to our infographic number 2 on page 83. The food web of the Everglades is very complex and varies among the different ecosystems found there. Periphyton algae mats form the base of the food web and may be the most important producers in the ecosystem. The American alligator is the main apex predator, although when young, is also the prey of various birds, fish, mammals, and even other alligators. And that brings us to key concept number 3. The trophic levels of the food chain are shown as a pyramid. Lower levels are larger than upper ones. Because energy enters only at the producer level, and the organisms at each level use most of the energy they have taken in, only a small percentage is passed on to support the next level. So the different levels at which organisms feed or capture energy are known as trophic levels. Consumers are organized into trophic levels based on what they eat. Primary consumers eat producers. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers. Tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers, and so on, ending with the apex predators in the last trophic level. Of course, many consumer species often feed at more than one trophic level. Wood storks eating crayfish are feeding at trophic level 3, but when they eat small fish like bluegill, they are feeding at trophic level 4. Alligators eat a wide variety of animals, turtles, fish, birds, even mammals like the raccoon, making them the apex predator in many Everglades food chains. So when any of these organisms die, they are eaten by an army of consumers known as detrivores. Animal-like worms, insects, and crabs that feed on dead plants and animals, and decomposers, which are organisms like bacteria and fungi that break down decomposing organic matter all the way down to its constituent atoms and molecules. This returns matter back to the water or soil, where it can be taken up again by producers, simply one step of many that make up the complex matter cycles that move matter through all levels of the trophic pyramid. As one moves up the food chain, energy and biomass, that is matter comprising all the organisms at that level, decreases, creating a trophic pyramid. The reason that any consumer trophic level is smaller than the one below it is simple. Nearly every organism uses up the majority of the energy and matter it has acquired in the complicated act of living. So when an organism is killed and consumed by a predator, it only passes on a small percentage of energy and matter it consumed during its lifetime. So I'll refer you back to the laws of thermodynamics. As researchers discovered in the 1980s, it was a kink in the food chain that hurt the wood storks. While they feed on many things, they prefer fish, and not just any fish, but those between 1 and 6 inches long. Most fish need more than a single season to grow this big. In fact, they need wetlands that are flooded for longer than a year and very rarely go completely dry. It turns out that as humans altered water cycles in South Florida, there were fewer and fewer such areas and thus fewer fish for the storks to feed their young. Much of Florida is made up of low, flat land that floods during the rainy season, like that's June through September, and that delivers about 75% of its annual rainfall. Many wetland fish grow and reproduce in this expanding habitat. Then, as rains taper off, water begins to recede, and the fish become concentrated in small ponds and sloughs, free-flowing channels of water that develop between sawgrass prairies, pronounced slough. Foraging storks follow these receding waters from upland ponds to lowland coastal areas, feeding on fish. They are so dependent on this water cycle that their breeding cycle is regulated by water levels. Such a profound connectedness between landscape and life is common in the Everglades. And that brings us to infographic number 3 on page 85. Energy enters at the base of the food chain in the first trophic level via photosynthesis and is passed on to higher levels as consumers feed on other organisms. This is shown as a pyramid, smaller on the top, because only a small percentage of the energy is passed on to each higher level, with the majority being lost to the environment, usually as heat from the energy that the organism burns in day-to-day life before it is eaten. Most food chains have only 4 or 5 levels due to this progressive loss of energy. Although the actual amount varies from ecosystem to ecosystem, for illustration purposes, we are showing 10% passing on to the next higher level. And remember, refer back to the laws of thermodynamics for this. And that brings us to key concept number 4. Species diversity is measured in terms of the number of different species present, which is its richness, and the relative abundance of each species, which is its evenness. High richness and evenness tend to make a community more resilient to environmental changes. So strong connections between species and their environment and among other species give rise to ecological diversity, a measure of the number of species at each trophic level, as well as the total number of trophic levels and available niches. Greater ecological diversity means more niches and thus more ways for matter and energy to be accessed and exchanged. This generally increases a community's resilience, that is, its ability to adjust to changes in the environment and return to its original state rather quickly. Species diversity, which refers to the variety of species in an area, tends to increase as ecological diversity increases. It is measured in 2 different ways, species richness and species evenness. Species richness refers to the total number of different species in a community. Species evenness refers to the relative abundance of each individual species. In general, populations at a higher trophic level will have fewer members than those at the lower trophic level, but populations within the same trophic level should have relatively similar numbers. If they do, the community is said to have a high species evenness. If, on the other hand, 1 or 2 species dominate any given trophic level and there are few members of other species, then the community is said to have low species evenness. In such uneven communities, the less abundant species is at greater risk of dying out. Both richness and evenness have an impact on the community. In general, higher species richness and evenness make for a more diverse community and a more intricate food web. Greater intricacy enables more matter and energy to be brought into the system and also makes the community less likely to collapse in the face of a calamity. Of course, it isn't always as simple as quote-unquote more species are better. When non-native species are introduced to an area, species richness may initially increase, but these non-natives may disrupt the community in ways that ultimately diminish diversity. The Everglades is facing a formidable invasive species that is even challenging alligators for the role of apex predator and changing the food web in the area. the Burmese python. And that brings us to our infographic number 4 on page 86. The species diversity in an area is a measure of species richness, that is the total number of species, and species evenness, which is a comparison of the population size of each species. The Everglades contains forested areas known as hardwood hammocks. Each forest plot shown here contains 15 trees, but they differ in terms of species richness and evenness. And that brings us to key concept number 5. Community composition is affected by the physical structure of the habitat, with some species preferring to inhabit ecotone regions where one habitat meets another, or the edge of the ecosystem, and others staying deep within one habitat, which is the core of the ecosystem. Human impact that fragments habitats may increase edge and decrease core areas, harming core species and disrupting community connections. So a community's composition and diversity are also heavily influenced by its physical features. As abiotic physical features like temperature and moisture change, so does community composition. So this often happens in ecotones, places where two different ecosystems meet, like the edge between a forest and a field or between a river and a shore. The different physical makeup of these edges create different conditions known as edge effects, which either attract or repel certain species. For example, it is drier, warmer, and more open at the edge between a forest and a field than it is further into the forest. This difference produces conditions favorable to some species, but not others. Ecotones may also attract some species that use different aspects of the two adjacent communities. Fish, such as young snapper or grunts, for example, prefer to live in areas where the seagrass beds are fairly close to the shoreline, populated by mangrove trees. The mangrove prop roots, which anchor the trees into the wet, sandy ground below, offer fish safety from predators during the day, but are close enough to the seagrass beds where the snapper and grunts feed at night for easy commuting. These fish are not found in coastal areas without the combination of protective coastal mangrove trees and close-by offshore seagrass beds. Species that thrive in edge habitats like this are called edge species. Other species, those that can only be found deep within a given habitat, are called core species. Some of the many species that find food and refuge in the seagrass, such as crustaceans, sea urchins, and worms, prefer to stay in core areas where they are better hidden and protected from wave action, or can make use of deeper sediment buildup in these inner areas. Unfortunately, human actions often fragment large expanses of intact core habitat, increasing edge habitat. This fragmentation scenario plays out in ecosystems around the world, especially terrestrial ones such as forests or grasslands, where urban, suburban, agricultural, and industrial development create patchworks of formerly expansive habitats. Edge species may thrive in these particular patchy habitats, but because core species may not venture out across the edge in search of new habitat, they are easily trapped by habitat fragmentation. We may eliminate these core species altogether if we don't leave enough core area behind. In other instances, edge habitats are totally destroyed and replaced with other habitats, such as the removal of mangrove forests in areas undergoing coastal development, eliminating the edge species that resided there. And that brings us to our infographic number 5 on page 88. The mangrove seagrass ecotone provides an example of an edge effect. Fish, such as immature gray snapper and blue-striped grunt, commute between the mangrove trees and the seagrass beds. The proximity of these two areas is vital to provide both the protection during the day and the feeding opportunities at night that these young fish need. Moving on, habitat structure influences where species live. Edge species, like white-tailed deer, prefer habitats with forests and field edges, whereas core species, like some warblers, small birds, prefer the inner areas of the forest and do not readily venture into edge regions. And that brings us to key concept number 6. Keystone species are particularly important to other members of their community, and if their numbers decline, many other species may be negatively affected. So wood storks are spectacular flyers. They can reach altitudes as high as 5,000 feet and glide for miles without flapping their wings. When foraging grounds dry up, flood, or are converted into human developments, these aerial skills are pushed to the limit, flying as much as 75 miles in some cases in search of food. But they weren't the only species to struggle in the newly developed region. As cities replaced swamps and roads replaced rivers in the Florida Everglades, the flow of water was disrupted like never before. As sloughs ran dry, key detrivores and decomposers like worms, grass shrimp, and microbial communities that had thrived there were decimated. With each species lost, connections were broken, leading to the decline of snakes, fish, alligators, turtles, and wading birds that fed on them. All species contribute to their ecosystem, but it turns out that some are particularly important. The replacement of mangrove forest with oceanfront resorts illustrates this point. It turns out that mangrove trees are a keystone species, that is, one that provides a unique service that impacts its community more than its mere abundance would predict. It's a species that many other species depend on, and one whose loss creates a substantial ripple effect, disrupting interactions for many other species and, ultimately, altering food webs. From their natural habitat at the water's edge, mangrove prop roots stabilize the shoreline and provide shelter for a wide variety of fish. So when the mangrove forests are cleared, many other species suffer. The fish that hide among their roots, the fish that feed on those fish, and so on. Alligators are also a keystone species in the Everglades, one that a great many species depend on during the dry season. As the waters recede, depressions made by alligators, which we call gator holes, are some of the few places that still hold standing water. These holes, which range from about 5 to 50 feet in diameter and from about half a foot to 5 feet deep, become refuges for fish, invertebrates, and aquatic plants. They also become very attractive to the animals who feed on those aquatic creatures. Without gator holes, many species would not survive the dry season. As an apex predator, alligators also help control the population of a wide variety of species. This generalist predator tends to prey on the most abundant populations at any given time. As one population declines in abundance, the alligator turns to other, more abundant prey. This allows the declining population to recover and keeps the abundant population in check. Wood storks also depend on the presence of alligators, but not just for the dry season gator holes. In the 1980s, Rogers and his colleagues embarked on a comprehensive study of stork nests in an effort to see which type of trees the storks preferred to nest and whether the availability of those trees was impacting their ability to breed. Rogers and his team found that wood storks will nest in just about anything as long as it is surrounded by water that is patrolled by alligators. And that brings us to infographic number 6 on page 90. Some species are important to their ecosystem. If a keystone species is lost or declines in number, the ecosystem could change drastically, and other species that depend on it may suffer or be lost. And that brings us to key concept number 7. Interactions within and between species may be beneficial, neutral, or harmful to participants, but all are critical to energy capture and flow and to matter cycling. Changes that interfere with these interactions can imperil many others and decrease the overall functioning of the ecosystem and the services it provides. So communities are all about relationships. Successful communities are those where a balance has evolved between all the organisms living there. Species interactions serve many purposes. For example, they control populations and affect carrying capacity. Biodiversity is also important because more diversity means more ways to capture, store, and exchange energy and matter. But it is not sheer numbers that matter most. It is all the connections among species, how they help or hurt one another, that determines how and how well an ecosystem works. Each species is unique and thus interacts in its own unique ways with all the species around it. So many species have adaptations that bind them to others, that allow them to coexist, or that facilitate predation or escape from predators. In the Everglades, for example, alligators have adaptations like sharp teeth and powerful jaws that allow them to stalk and capture prey, while most of the fish they prey on have adaptations like camouflage and a wary nature that help them avoid capture. Competition, the vying among organisms for limited resources, is another way that species interact. In general, it is subtle rather than outright fighting. Intraspecific competition, that which occurs among members of the same species, is generally stronger than interspecific competition, that which occurs among members of different species. That is because members of the same species share exactly the same niche and thus compete for all resources in that niche, whereas members of different species may compete for only a single resource like water. So other neighbors, those that prey on the same food or inhabit similar niches, find a way to partition resources. That is, they divvy up the goods in a way that reduces competition and allows several species to coexist. For example, limpkins and snail kites, two niche specialist birds that feed almost exclusively on apple snails, hunt in different regions of the Everglades. This strategy, known as resource partitioning, increases the ecosystem's overall capture of matter and energy and thus benefits the entire community. There are other strategies, too, that keep an ecosystem functioning and strong. Some of these interactions show a tremendous interdependency on the part of participants, known as symbiosis. These relationships can take one of three forms. The most commonly recognized form of symbiosis is mutualism, where both species benefit from the relationship. Research has revealed a mutualistic relationship between storks and alligators. As mentioned earlier, nesting near patrolling alligators increases the breeding success of storks. But the alligators also benefit by feeding on the nestlings that drop out of the storks' nests. Research has shown that alligators that patrolled the sloughs that surrounded breeding bird colonies were better fed and had larger fat reserves than those feeding in other areas. In the symbiotic relationship known as commensalism, one species benefits from the relationship and the other is unaffected. For example, in fields and pastures throughout the southeast, cattle egrets follow grazing cattle, snatching up the bugs disturbed by the hooves of the passing cows. This has no effect on the cows. They don't eat the bugs and are not disturbed by the bugs, but it greatly enhances the foraging efficiency of the egrets. Parasitism, where one species benefits from the relationship and the other is negatively affected, is also a form of symbiosis due to the close biological tie between the parasite and the host. Parasites may be external, such as ticks, fleas, and leeches, or internal, such as intestinal worms. By ensuring that all populations persist, even as individuals die, these delicate checks and balances allow more energy to be captured and exchanged, and thus increase the amount of biomass the ecosystem is able to produce. When individual species are lost, or when a landscape is physically altered, the balance is tipped, and when that happens, things can fall apart fast. And that brings us to infographic number 7 on page 92. The heart of a functioning community is its species interactions. Some interactions are beneficial and others can cause conflict, but all are important in keeping matter and energy flowing through an ecosystem. Moving on, Resource partitioning is a strategy in which different species use different parts or aspects of a resource rather than compete directly for exactly the same resource. And that brings us to key concept number 8. Human impact often reduces species diversity. It may be difficult to restore all the species and their connections when we try to repair ecosystem damage. Therefore, our best course of action is to avoid the damage in the first place. Indicator species like the wood stork gave ecologists an early warning that the Everglades ecosystem was suffering from the drastic changes imposed by human impact. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was called on to investigate the damage to the Everglades that resulted from nearly 50 years of unchecked expansion. They found that the size of the Everglades had been reduced by 50% since the late 1800s. Constructed canals and levees had dramatically altered water levels, leaving some areas parched and others flooded, and poorly timed water releases were further starving ecosystems that had already been affected by salt levels that were too high, excessive nutrients from agricultural runoff, and an ever-growing list of non-native species. Avoiding the ecosystem damage in the first place is always the best option, but when the damage is done, fixing it is the work of restoration ecologists. Restoration ecology is the science that deals with the repair of damaged or disturbed ecosystems. Indicator species like the stork not only alert ecologists to a problem, but also are monitored as a gauge of success in the restoration efforts. Is the population recovering as expected? It requires a special blend of skills, not only biology and chemistry, but also engineering and a heavy dose of politics. In the year 2000, the U.S. Congress enacted the most comprehensive and expensive ecological repair project in history. The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CERP, included more than 60 construction projects to be completed over a 30-year period. The idea was to restore some of the natural flow of water through the Everglades, starting with the Tamiami Trail. The Tamiami Trail is a 150-mile stretch of U.S. highway that connects the South Florida cities of Tampa and Miami. This is a serious barrier to fresh water flow in the region. It's also heavily traveled. That means the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers must not only tear down the road, but also build something in its place. For the wood stork, things are looking up. The population is slowly increasing across the southeastern United States, and in 2014, the species was downlisted from endangered to threatened. The number of breeding pairs in the Everglades sometimes exceeds the restoration target minimum of 1,500 breeding pairs, but numbers fall lower than that during poor weather years. Even before humans stepped in to drain the Everglades, wood stork nesting success has always fluctuated with weather, sometimes wildly. The ideal conditions include a wet summer and fall, a boost to fish populations, followed by a gradual drying during winter and an even drier spring, conditions that concentrate fish into shallow pools. Just such a year was 2017, and wood stork breeding pairs increased dramatically with 3,894 nests recorded in that year's South Florida wading bird survey. Similar numbers were seen in 2018. Looking beyond the yearly fluctuations that weather brings, researchers report slow but steady improvements, but the species is still falling short of restoration targets over the long term. And that brings us to infographic 8 on page 94. Restoration efforts attempt to return an ecosystem back to its original condition or as close as possible. And that brings us to our key concept number 9. Over time, ecosystems naturally transition from one community to another in response to changing environmental conditions. An understanding of this ecological succession process can guide our restoration efforts. So, although the changes the Everglades have experienced are extreme, changes to ecological communities are really the norm. Nature is not static. Predictable transitions can sometimes be observed in which one community replaces another, a process known as ecological succession. Primary succession begins when pioneer species move into new areas that have not yet been colonized. In terrestrial ecosystems, the earliest pioneer species are usually lichens, a symbiotic combination of algae and fungus. Lichens can tolerate the barren conditions. As time goes by and lichens live, die, and decompose, they produce soil. As soil accumulates, other small plants move in, typically sun-tolerant annual plants that live 1 year, produce seed, and then die. And the plant community grows. Gradually, the plant growth itself changes the physical conditions of the area, covering sun-drenched regions with broad, shady leaves, for example. Since these conditions are no longer suitable for the plants that created them, new species move in, and those changes beget even more changes until the pioneers have been completely replaced by a succession of new species and communities. Secondary succession describes a similar process that occurs in an area that once held life but has been damaged somehow. The level of damage the ecosystem has suffered determines which stage of plant community moves in. For example, a forest completely obliterated by fire may start close to the beginning with small herbs and grasses, whereas one that has suffered only moderate losses may start midway through the process with shrubs or sun-tolerant trees moving in. The stages are roughly the same for any terrestrial area that can support a forest. First, annual species, then shrubs, then sun-tolerant trees, then shade-tolerant trees. Grasslands flow in a similar pattern with different species of grasses and forbs, that is, small leafy plants moving in over time. Wetland areas also go through succession, responding to the presence of water and sediment depth. In the Everglades, each ecosystem is guided along this path by its own constellation of forces. Some, like the iconic sawgrass ecosystems, are fire adapted. Fire returns them to early stages again and again, where the underwater roots of the emergent plants, those that are rooted underwater but grow above the waterline, survive and quickly regrow. Others, if left undisturbed, would pass through successional stages of pioneers, grasses, to shrubs or small trees, to larger species of trees, depending on the deposition of soil and the proximity of the water table. The progression of ecological succession in damaged areas might be viewed by some as a repair sequence. While we can certainly step in to assist in this natural progression to help a damaged ecosystem recover to a former state, the ecosystem is simply doing what comes naturally, responding to changing conditions. Intact ecosystems have a better chance at recovering from and thus surviving perturbations. More complex communities are also more resilient because it is less likely that the loss of one or two species will be felt by the community at large. Even if some links in the food web are lost, other species are there to fill the void. Of course, if a keystone species is lost, the community will feel the effect. The loss of the alligator from the complex Everglades community would impact many species and change the face of the ecosystem. However precarious their recovery might be, wood storks have rebounded in some areas. Some say this rebound is the result of careful conservation efforts. Others insist that it is merely the result of above-average rainfall in some years. And that brings us to infographic number 9 on page 96. In terrestrial ecosystems, we see the natural stages of succession occur whenever a new area is colonized or an established area is damaged. Sun-tolerant species give way to shade-tolerant ones as more soil is built up, supporting larger plant species. Moving on, succession in wetlands can actually go both ways due to periodic fires, cyclic rainfall patterns, and variable water levels. Rising water might flood an area anew, or sediment buildup might continue to raise the land relative to the water level. In the absence of disturbance, succession will progress to the hardwood hammock forest when sediment builds up enough to expose dry land. And that brings us to this chapter's core message. Ecological communities are groups of organisms that interact, groups of organisms that are connected, and can be negatively affected by humans. Moving on to our summary, all the pieces of the ecological community are connected. Community complexity aids in resiliency, but the loss of a keystone species, such as the pileated woodpecker or alligator, has drastic consequences to a community. Wood storks are an example of an indicator species, and they continue to alert us to changes in the Everglades community and the broader surrounding area.